Welcome to Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Ruthie Blum, and I'm joined this week by my co-host, Mark Regev, who's in Europe right now. Hi, Mark.
Hi, great to be with you for another episode, Ruthie.
Great to be with you, too. Next week, you'll be back here in the studio. We have a lot to talk about, as usual, this week, because the news just keeps getting away from us. I'd like to start by discussing the supposedly crystallizing ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Biden's special envoy to the Middle East, is right now in Lebanon, where he is meeting with negotiators, and he is supposedly arriving in Israel from Beirut, probably today. And today is Wednesday, November 20th. Now, he said yesterday that we're close to a deal. Those weren't his words. He said, it's within our grasp. And, I think that's nonsense, because the main sticking point that Hezbollah refuses to agree to is one that Israel cannot concede. And that is the ability, after any deal is made, for Israel to preempt or retaliate against any Hezbollah buildup of arms or movement of terrorists, anything like that. Otherwise, no Israeli will move back to his or her home in the north of the country. And so what do you think about that, Mark?
I'm a little more optimistic than you, which is probably pretty standard for the way we have our conversations in our weekly podcast. I think this can work. And I'll tell you why I believe it can. The real negotiation is between Israel and the United States of America. And it's all over our ability to use force if Hezbollah breaks the agreement. And the assumption is that they will. I mean, Hezbollah is Hezbollah. They're not going to suddenly become, the Peace Corps. These are ruthless, extreme terrorists. But that's why it's crucial that in any agreement, Israel retains the right to preempt, to act militarily, to prevent Hezbollah from breaking the agreement, from, let's say, moving its forces again south of the Litani or rearming itself through Syria. Now, because we're talking about a bilateral understanding between the United States and Israel, I mean, the Lebanese government is going to be formally part of this agreement, but it's clear that the real understanding is bilateral Washington-Jerusalem. The sad fact is, and especially sad for the people of Lebanon, is the government of Lebanon is irrelevant. It's a failed state. The real power is with Hezbollah. But if there is a U.S.-Israel agreement on this principle that gives Israel the idea to act when we need to act, I think that's crucial, that's possible, that's doable. It doesn't have to say that the Lebanese government agrees to this, but they will know of the U.S.-Israel understandings. And I don't want to say I can say that in many ways the government of Lebanon is irrelevant. What is relevant is Hezbollah. And the reason they're willing to accept this agreement is they're desperate for a ceasefire, which is a sign that our military operation is actually succeeding.
Well, surprise, surprise, Mark. I totally disagree with you. Hezbollah is not interested in a ceasefire. Hezbollah is interested in retaining the same amount of power and ability to rearm as it had after the 2006 war and when the Resolution 1701 was signed, which Hezbollah proceeded from the first minute to violate. The point is Hezbollah has been blitzing Israel with rockets, including in the center of the country, to show that it is actually not losing the war and therefore trying to pressure Israel into wanting a ceasefire deal. No, that's not the way this has to go. Israel has to show that it's no more of these wars of attrition. Israel has to be the victor and make it clear to Hezbollah that any one false move and we're back in there or flying over there. Now, my question is, how much of this is dependent on the next 2 months and what happens with the lame duck presidency in Washington right now? So it's possible that everybody is waiting for President-elect Trump's inauguration to figure out what to do. And that goes for Iran, which, by the way, is reportedly pretty much abandoning Hezbollah. But leaving that aside, Hezbollah is not behaving like an enemy who has put up the white flag, not at all. And so there's no point in negotiating with Hezbollah. And there's no point in negotiating with Amos Hochstein either. The point is to force Hezbollah into submission.
So I think we are doing that, Ruthie. I think we are forcing by our military strikes against their leadership, against their military infrastructure, against their command and control. We are slowly but surely forcing them into a submission. Now, it's clear, I said before, they're not going to change their stripes. Hezbollah will remain Hezbollah, a ruthless enemy. I have no illusions. But what does Hezbollah want? What do they want at the moment? They want a timeout. They want the end of these Israeli strikes against their infrastructure, against their leadership, against their commanders, and so forth. And the framework of that timeout will be this U.S.-Israel agreement that we spoke about earlier, an agreement that will, I understand, give Israel the ability to act when needed to be if Hezbollah breaks understandings reached. In other words, you are correct when you say, Ruthie, that 1701 was just a piece of paper and Hezbollah, broke the rules from day one. That's 100% correct. But the difference is we're talking now about a different arrangement whereby it's the framework of 1701, but Israel, in a bilateral understanding between us and the Americans, will have the ability to enforce the agreement. And the real question you should ask, Ruthie, is will Israel have the determination to enforce the agreement? And I think after what we've been through over the last year, I am more certain than I would have been before that Israel will have the commitment and the resolution to enforce the agreement, to use military force if and when Hezbollah breaks the agreement.
But Mark, Hezbollah says no to that clause of the agreement, number one. Number two, we still haven't figured out, though Israel has already conceded on way too much with the United States, as usual with this administration. And by saying, well, there will be a possibility for some of the Lebanese to move back to their homes in southern Lebanon, which would be a disaster, by the way, because, it will be impossible to separate those from terrorists returning to the south of the country. The point is, though, Hezbollah has said no to that clause. So what deal are you talking about? Second of all, what they need to have is something imposed on them. And the 1701, again, the Biden administration keeps referring to it. Why? Because the idea then is, okay, well, who will enforce it? Last time nobody enforced it except UNIFIL, and we see how totally useless and corrupt that organization is, like every other body in the UN. The point is, who's going to enforce it? Well, if the IDF isn't policing that border, and if Israel doesn't have at least some minimal control of a kind of no man's land between Israel and Lebanon, it's not going to work. Also, the terrain there, they're higher up. They have, the homes in southern Lebanon, they can look out into windows of kibbutzim and communities in northern Israel. So that's untenable, right? But in any case, Hezbollah has said no to that clause of enabling Israel in the event that Hezbollah violates and rearms and fires rockets, that Israel retains the right to preempt and or attack. They said no to that. And by the way, so did Lebanon say no to that.
So let's be clear here. You ask an important question: who will enforce the agreement? And there is a clear answer: it will be Israel. There's no alternative. Now, you sort of hinted before, why are we negotiating this at all now? Because it's an outgoing lame duck administration. My understanding, and of course I'm not in the room when these conversations are happening, other people smarter than me are doing that. But my understanding is the incoming Trump administration wants these things, if possible, to be behind them before January 20th, before the president comes in. He'd like to see a ceasefire in place, the president-elect, before he comes into office. He said that publicly. He said
also about Gaza, he said he wants the job finished before he enters office. No, that's not Biden administration talk. It's not. Ceasefire, UN agreements. No. Trump's music is very different. He says, get the job.
I agree, but I'm saying that he does not.
Yeah. Well,
does he not want, would he not want an agreement prior to him coming to office on January 20th? The answer is yes. And I think, I don't know for a fact, but it's clear that when Ron Dermer, who was negotiating these issues for Israel in Washington, the Minister Ron Dermer, the Minister of Security, Strategic Affairs, yeah, he was in Washington. In parallel to his meetings with the outgoing administration, he made an effort to speak with the incoming administration. That was reported highly. And so my assumption is, knowing the way Netanyahu thinks, knowing the way that Dermer thinks, the idea that what they're doing with the Biden administration in its last 2 months has been coordinated with the incoming administration. And I think that was a clever thing to do. And once again, I believe President Trump would like these issues to be behind him when he's sworn in on January 20th.
No, that's true. I don't dispute that. He would like them behind him. But the point is, as he said with Iran and has hinted and also almost said outright, that if Israel has to do it, oh, by the way, in the incoming administration, we have Marco Rubio as nominee for foreign minister, not foreign minister, Secretary of State. And he says it also. Israel has to do it. It has to do. If it has to take out Iran's nuclear sites, it's got to do it. Okay. You are talking about a whole different kettle of fish here. So whatever Minister Dermer spoke about with Trump's people and with Biden's people, one thing is clear, that when you say we need an agreement, if Hezbollah doesn't agree to it, there is no agreement. We cannot make agreements with Washington unless because otherwise, excuse me, obviously that's what Washington thinks. Otherwise, they wouldn't send Amos Hochstein to Lebanon. They would have invited people from Israel to Washington, or he should come to Israel and say, okay, here's the agreement we have between us, and any one false move on Hezbollah's part, you blitz the crap out of them. No, that would be an agreement between Washington and Israel. This is not. Washington is playing footsie with Lebanon and Hezbollah.
So all I can say is the most important thing will be what is agreed to between the United States and Israel. That's the fundamental thing upon which everything is based. If we cannot reach an agreement, so there's not going to be a ceasefire. But if there is agreement between the US and Israel, once again, Hezbollah's position and the government of Lebanon's position is secondary. Because once again, this will be a US, and once again, I can't see a basis for an agreement without this. This will be a US commitment to Israel, signed, formal, saying that if Hezbollah breaks the deal, we will have the right to act. And so once again, that answers your question on who enforces the deal. It's us. We're not going to subcontract out our security, definitely not to the United Nations, definitely not to the government of Lebanon. There will be understandings reached, and they'll all be guaranteed by this US-Israel commitment that Israel has enforcement power if and when the agreement is breached. Now, I want to ask you the following. What is the alternative, Ruthie? Because if the alternative is that Israel has to occupy all of Lebanon and the war goes on forever and ever and ever. I mean, you've heard me say this in the past. I was an Israeli soldier in Lebanon following the 1982 war. That's a long time ago. But Lebanon, we've got to remember the problem of mission creep and of overreaching. If we've hit Hezbollah hard, and if we've damaged the organization, if we've taken out its leadership, if we've destroyed a large part of its military capability, not totally, but Hezbollah for its desire for, as I said before, a timeout now, if that can be the basis of a US-Israel understanding that gives us the right to act, I think that is maximizing our advantages on the battlefield for political benefit of the people of Israel and creating a new reality in the north, which will allow the tens of thousands of Israelis who are being forced out of their homes to return and rebuild their homes in northern Israel. It's not a perfect solution, but if you're waiting for a perfect solution, you're never going to get one.
No, but I will say we've heard from soldiers on the ground in Lebanon that, yes, they've taken out massive amounts of rocket launchers, rockets, terrorists. They're doing a fantastic job. However, they all say, I mean, the soldiers on the ground, I'm not talking now about the political echelon. They all say there is so much more to be done, that every single house, we see these pictures, okay, because, CNN and the other networks like to show all those buildings being, falling in Lebanon and showing us attacking Beirut. What they don't show is what's going on in those buildings, all right? The point is that there's much more to do, and Hezbollah still has so many rockets and launchers and ballistic missiles, which it's been showing us daily, all day, and continues to this, including this morning. I imagine that as you and I are speaking, there are rocket sirens going off all over the place. So, maybe Hezbollah wants a ceasefire so that it can rearm, of course. The point is, it has to agree to stop fighting and move back far beyond the Litani River and not to rearm, etc. How we will be able to police that is not clear, and certainly not to allow any international force to be responsible for that, because that would be a disaster. But I would like to now bring this to Gaza, because, though they are different battlefields, they're connected, because all of this, the head of the octopus, as we like to say, is Iran. And in Gaza, again, we've made immense progress, but we still have 101 hostages there. And we've destroyed much infrastructure, terrorist infrastructure. We've killed many, many terrorists. But again, the Biden administration, along with the UN, is concerned, civilians, and there's famine that we're supposedly causing, which we're not. If you don't enter more humanitarian aid, the United States ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said she's so concerned the situation is dire. If Israel doesn't continue to watch out and send more humanitarian aid, never mind that aid has been stolen by Hamas and looted this week, by what everyone's calling gangs, non-state actors, whatever that means. And Hamas even said, oh yes, we're killing those members of gangs who are stealing the aid. Because, of course, Hamas wants to steal the aid for itself. My point is that's not how an ally behaves, as the United States ambassador to the UN has been behaving. So Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, gave an amazing speech at the Knesset plenum, a long one, and he spelled out everything. And one of the things he said about the hostages, I think he's changing course now. It's not negotiate, deals, because those, you can't negotiate with terrorists. What he says is, okay, he's going to pay $5 million per any hostage who's released and give a lot of money to any information leading to the release or freeing of hostages. So this is a move in the right direction. It's true. I hate to say, I hate it that we have to bribe them, but the Gazans, we like to say they enlem Elohim. They have no God. In other words, the hand that feeds them or threatens them is the one they obey. And so now we've got to take charge of that.
So it's clear that there are problems in Gaza with the humanitarian aid. I'm not sure they're Israel's fault at all, because we keep sending the trucks in, but somehow the aid is delivered, yes? And let's remember also that Hamas has an overarching strategic goal, and that is actually that there should be a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, because from their point of view, it's simple. Humanitarian crisis in Gaza or international pressure on Israel, stop the war, Hamas stays alive. And so you can make a feasible argument that Hamas has the ability and the desire to prevent humanitarian aid getting into the people of Gaza who need it in order to advance their own political agenda, because they don't give a hoot about the people of Gaza. That's one part of it, and that's why Hamas has also been stealing the aid and siphoning it off and selling it at high prices, because that's good for Hamas and its people. At the same time, in parallel, I think there's also a scenario whereby, as we have been defeating and destroying Hamas, there is no alternative government authority at the moment in Gaza. And therefore, you have chaos. It's a bit like, you remember immediately following the invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush. There was rioting and there was stealing and there was all sorts of things going on. I mean, there were bad things happened at the famous museum in Baghdad, yes? And I remember Donald Rumsfeld talking about the disruption and so forth in that interim period between when one regime falls, the Hamas regime, and another regime takes its place. And so maybe that is inevitable, though I think it's our obligation to do what we can to minimize that. And the Israeli government has been exploring all sorts of ways how to deal with it. One is, and I don't think there's been a decision on this, but one idea that's being put out there is that the Israeli army be more involved in a hands-on way in spreading, making sure aid reaches the recipients of the aid. Another idea is the privatization, that this be done by humanitarian organizations, not UNRWA, but non-political humanitarian organizations, though that's maybe an oxymoron because all of them could be a bit political. And that they would have some sort of private security, the sort of people who are going to wars and, going to combat zones and are paid very highly to do it. The former combat soldiers, from Western countries, mercenaries, so to speak, who would give private security to humanitarian aid. But it's clear we have to think more carefully about what happens in this interim period, because chaos, I think, serves Hamas. And we have to provide alternatives to the chaos.
Well, I'll tell you what I think has served Hamas for the last 13 months. And that is that no matter how many terrorists Israel kills, including its fearless leader, Yahya Sinwar, and no matter how many rocket launchers and tunnels the IDF destroys, the political power of Hamas remains as long as it's got the food and the medicine. And all along, there were people like me and many others who said it's the humanitarian aid because Hamas steals it. And because Hamas took charge of it from UNRWA, okay? Because UNRWA are all Hamas. So never mind about that for a minute. That it was perpetuating Hamas rule in Gaza. And that is exactly what the Biden administration was forcing Israel to do. And it's been dragging out. And rather than allowing Israel to just fight and win, was okay. Gazans are hungry, so we're withholding weapons because you're using our bombs to kill civilians. Which was not true. We did everything we could to prevent civilian casualties. We know that the ratio is unheard of in military history. And by the way, the population in Gaza has continued to grow over the last year. So people accusing us of genocide, that's also nonsense. My point is that when your allies are tying your hands, and when the United Nations is helping Hamas, and when your prime minister and his cabinet are aware that they can't just, fight Washington, that's how we ended up in a war that's going on and on. I believe we would have had hostages, at least more hostages, home by now. We would have, if we had not succumbed to the baloney about the humanitarian aid that is not getting to any innocent civilian, and it certainly isn't getting to the hostages, who, by the way, have not even been seen by the International Red Cross. Another travesty. While the Red Cross is demanding to see terrorists from October 7th in Israeli jails, oh no, that's okay. We've got to feed them and give them good conditions and let the Red Cross see them, but not the hostages.
So of course, that is a very sore point for Israelis. And as you know, we've just got, 101 hostages, unfortunately, many of them not alive, but still being held by Hamas in Gaza. And there cannot be closure in Gaza until all those hostages are home. That's clear.
Right.
Those who are alive will come back for medical treatment and to rebuild their lives. Those who are dead will come back for burial, and their families will have closure. And there can't be an end of this in Gaza without the hostage issue being solved. There's a resolution before the Security Council, which I hope the Americans will be vetoing, which is calling for a unilateral ceasefire in Gaza. And I understand that it's, the hostages aren't even mentioned. And that's obviously unacceptable to Israel. I believe it's unacceptable to the United States. It'll be sad if other democratic countries like Britain and the French and so forth decide to support a resolution that leaves the hostages out. That would be a terrible scenario. And what I understand the Americans will most likely veto, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. That's America using its moral force in the world for a good cause.
First of all, I wouldn't count on this administration vetoing it, okay? This is a clone of the Obama administration, and we saw what the Obama administration did during its lame duck period. But I wanted to say that I think I want to correct you on one thing. The draft resolution the UN is preparing, I saw a copy of it, and then I saw an updated and edited version. It does include the hostages. The first one, though, didn't make a ceasefire conditional on the release of the hostages. And the second one does, but it equates them. The trouble is that this administration, along with the UN and many of our friends in Europe, friends, I say with air quotes, they are creating moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, between Israel and Hezbollah. All along, they've been doing it. And I would not trust this administration as far as I can throw it, except for one caveat. Biden seemed so elated that Kamala Harris lost that election because she and her buddies forced him out when he didn't want. He wanted to be the candidate. And they staged a coup against him. And the schadenfreude he exhibited when the Democrats lost was unmistakable. So if I have any ray of hope that he'll veto a disgusting UN resolution, it's that he wants to stick it to the Democrats who staged a coup against him.
So first of all, I think I don't agree with everything you just said, obviously, but I would say this. I think it's possible that a Biden free from domestic political pressure, because that's the advantage of being a lame duck president. And he says the whole time that he is an old-fashioned Catholic Irish Zionist. He can actually show it if he wants to in this last 2 months. He's not constrained in the way someone before an election is. And this is his opportunity to show us the people of Israel and friends of Israel around the world. He calls himself a friend of Israel. What does he do in this lame duck period? And on that point, Ruthie, I see we've reached the end of our time. And I look forward to seeing you next week when I will be sitting next to you in the JNS studio in Jerusalem.
Well, I can't wait for that, Mark. See you next week.
See you next week.